First of all, welcome everybody to the, I believe this is the kickoff panel to the NFOIC annual summit. Thank you very much for this panel will discuss issues around transparency during the pandemic, an issue that many of us have been dealing with now for many, many months. My name is Tom Verdin. I'm a board member of the NFOIC and also the AP's national editor for state government coverage. One of my passion projects each year is to oversee the Sunshine Week coverage for the AP. So I'm keenly aware of transparency, generally very interested in it, and also very interested on how this has played out during the pandemic. Before we get going, I will note that, as you probably see, the members are muted, but we very much want your questions. So please post that in the chat function. We're all familiar with that after so many months on Zoom, but please use the chat function to ask questions, and we will get to as many of those as we can toward the end of the panel presentations. This also is being recorded, so if you can't stay posted on the NFOIC website during and after the summit and will be readily accessible. So about the pandemic. The pandemic has had a profound effect on issues related to government transparency. At the outset, most governors suspended their state sunshine laws under emergency authorizations. Because the pandemic has not ended, some of those remain in effect even now. The consequences of that have been felt far and wide, and not just among the press or open government groups like the ones that NFOIC represents, but also members of the general public. Virtual public meetings allowed more people to watch because they could access those from their laptops wherever they might be. But this also raised real questions about the quality of that access. Some bodies muted the audience so there could be no verbal questions, or they required submitted questions and then screened those questions, or they mangled the questions, or they did not allow follow-up questions. Remote meetings also prevented reporters from being able to directly ask questions in person of elected officials. Courts delayed trials, and when they did hold them, they did so virtually. This raised real questions about the swift and fair administration of justice, but also hampered reporting. There are all kinds of things that take place inside a courtroom, a physical courtroom, and outside that can be newsworthy or very significant to the reporting process. Perhaps the biggest challenge that we've all encountered is access to public records. This was difficult at all levels, federal, state, local, even before the pandemic. But the governor's suspensions of state sunshine laws gave state and local agency officials an ideal excuse to deny and delay some more. To be sure, this is not a partisan issue. Some of the hardest states in which to access records are run by Democrats. I'm very excited about the panel we have today to discuss these questions and to answer your questions. Gunita Singh is a staff attorney at the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, who specializes in state and federal FOIA laws. She will discuss her work tracking government agencies' delays in responding to public records throughout the pandemic, as well as legislative changes related to meetings and records access. David Snyder is Executive Director of the First Amendment Coalition based in California. He will discuss his group's various efforts throughout the pandemic in California, which mirror challenges in many other states. Those include lawsuits to ensure access to public records, advocating for greater public participation in remote meetings, and lawsuits to enforce access rights to court hearings and records. We also will step outside the US and get the perspective of how the pandemic has challenged government transparency elsewhere in the world. This can provide crucial context to our own efforts, while also connecting us to the broader struggle for transparency and citizen access rights across the globe. Tonu Basu is Deputy Director of Thematic Policy at the Open Government Partnership. It's headquartered in Washington. It promotes transparency and government accountability around the globe. Tonu will discuss how the pandemic has changed accessibility and meetings and the efforts of the partnership to try to ensure transparency for the press and the public. And again, please use the chat function to raise any questions you might have. Gunita?
Thank you so much, Tom. I'm so excited to be on this panel. And I'll start off by noting they picked a perfect day to start cutting down trees outside my house and putting them in wood chippers. So I really hope that everyone can hear me okay. And if anything gets funky at any point, please just let me know. So obviously, one of the many issues that the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, where I work, is focused on is open government. And we have been hyper focused on this issue over the last 18 months, given that obviously one of the ripple effects of the pandemic has been its effect on open government, as Tom was mentioning. And what's really interesting is there's been a ton of variation across the federal government and among the states with respect to how they have handled records requests. And we know that because we've actually been collecting data since March of last year about this very topic. And what we found was that at the peak of restrictions to open government, which was last year throughout the fall and the summer, over 2/3 of public records laws had been significantly impaired. And we all know that the problem there is that journalists and others rely on those laws to learn about what their government is up to. And that's of maximum importance during any time of crisis and uncertainty. So I thought I would structure the next 10 minutes or so by summarizing in some more detail what those impediments to open government have looked like by providing a little cross-section of the main changes that we saw. So again, at the peak of the restrictions, we saw that at least 32 states plus DC had either amended their laws to suspend deadlines for responding to records requests, issued gubernatorial executive orders or proclamations to do the same thing, or state agencies or individual cities had either failed entirely to respond to requests or informed requesters that processing will be delayed. So I'll discuss each of those three umbrella categories by just giving a couple examples of each. With respect to the gubernatorial proclamations and orders, I think one example that at least some of us here are familiar with is Hawaii, where the governor inexplicably suspended the public records law there, which was for sure the most extreme modification that we saw on the public records front during the pandemic. And that suspension of the Uniform Information Practices Act in Hawaii was only lifted last month. Okay, so both the length and the severity of that suspension really stands out, which is why I wanted to start out with it. But an example that might be a little bit more emblematic of the traditional gubernatorial order that we've seen is Delaware, where the governor extended the deadlines to respond to requests by 15 days after the declared state of emergency ends, which for most of the pandemic had really felt like an indefinite suspension of the public records law because no one knew, unless you had a crystal ball, no one knew when that state of emergency was going to end. Now, that state of emergency to which this suspension of the public records law was tethered was replaced by a narrower public health emergency just 3 weeks ago. Okay, so fortunately, that means the original deadlines of the public records law once again control, but it was really, really tough for reporters on the ground in Delaware for nearly 2 years. With respect to legislative action, here in DC, where I live, the DC Council voted to allow agencies to delay responding to local FOIA requests during the public health emergency, and that had real consequences. Backlogs have grown to double the usual amount because DC agencies simply have not been keeping up with records requests. Now, fortunately, at the end of 2020, the council did vote to reinstate those normal deadlines, but by then the backlogs had really just grown exorbitant. And I really wonder if those practical consequences were considered in the first instance by our legislators. Another example of legislative action was in New Jersey, where the legislature voted to amend the Open Public Records Act, OPRA, to similarly suspend its deadlines during the state of emergency. And if you are paying attention, as you've probably predicted by now, that state of emergency was lifted this past summer, but agencies continued to cite to that Oprah amendment, probably because they got a little too comfortable delaying access. And finally, with respect to that final bucket, where no formal legislative or executive action was taken to suspend compliance with public records laws, like in California, which I know David is going to talk about, it was still often the case that individual agencies and cities informed requesters that compliance with requests for records would be delayed or put on hold indefinitely, often claiming that compliance was non-essential, which obviously breaks my heart. And I know it breaks the heart of all the panelists on this call today. And, you know, I want to note that if it sounds like I'm being a little hard on these government bodies during what was obviously an unprecedented time, I just want to say, you know, the fact of the matter is people still had to pay taxes, right? Families still had to navigate remote schooling. Many of us here had to navigate working from home and childcare. So it's incumbent upon each and every institution to adapt, especially when the public's right to know is at stake. And I actually think that that point about adaptation is a good segue into open meetings, because that's an area where we see a lot of adaptation, particularly for the better. You know, some open meetings violations have occurred during the pandemic, no doubt, but I think cities and states by and large have really attempted to leverage technology to facilitate public access to government meetings. And in some cases, it's been really simple to ensure that there have been avenues for public access while meetings have gone remote, right? You can use the raise hand function in Zoom, or you have dial-ins that folks can call into. Examples of jurisdictions where we see this are in California, where the governor issued an executive order authorizing electronic meetings and noting that members of the public should be getting that electronic access. And we saw the same sort of executive order issued in Alabama and Iowa and in tons of other states. And some of those trends are on the path toward permanency, like in Hawaii, where the legislature actually passed a law this summer, which will make permanent changes to its Sunshine Law to allow for remote meetings. And that's going to become effective on January 1st of next year. And the very first thing I did when I read about this development was, of course, I checked to see whether there are provisions for meaningful participation by the public, right? Because of course, it's not enough that government staff can be meeting on Zoom if I'm being excluded as a member of the public. But fortunately, the law really does speak to expanding public access and enhancing that status quo rather than just preserving it. And interestingly, it also contemplates members of the public who are not digitally literate or who don't have stable internet connections. So it would still require at least one physical meeting space where the public can come and participate if they need to. So that's sort of a broad overview of the state and local level. Tom, I'm happy to talk a little bit about the federal FOIA, or if there are any questions about what I've gone over so far, I'm happy to kind of pause there for a moment.
Gunita, actually, I was going to ask about that, because we do focus a lot through the coalitions and certainly state-based reporters on access to state and local records and meetings. But I know you and a colleague had written the law review article that was pretty broad, but in part of that, you did talk a little bit about the federal agencies. And maybe you could touch on that. You in particular, you mentioned the FBI and the State Department, and they had some pretty interesting responses at the outset of the pandemic. So I think, yes, if you could just spend a few minutes talking about the Reporters Committee's experience with federal agencies through FOIA, the immediate actions that some of those agencies took when the pandemic began, and then how it's played out. We're now almost 20 months since the beginning of the pandemic here in the US anyway, and are some of those restrictions still remaining, or have they modified?
Yeah, that's a perfect way of putting it. We've seen some interesting responses, to say the least. At the federal level, with the federal FOIA, there's of course been an extraordinary level of public interest in using FOIA to gather records about the pandemic itself, right? But also, everything else that we can use the FOIA for, right? Because the public's right to know hasn't just ceased to exist in the midst of this pandemic. So I think it's important to start off by noting that Congress did not change any of FOIA's deadlines in response to COVID-19. And the only way for FOIA's 20 business day statutory deadline to have been altered or suspended is if Congress amended FOIA, and that did not happen. So fortunately, many agencies have kept that in mind, and they've helpfully encouraged electronic submission of FOIA requests in order to more timely acknowledge and respond to requests at a time where many of their personnel have not physically been reporting to agency offices. And the CDC is one example of that. But Tom, you're absolutely right that the FBI is an example of an agency that suspended its entire records management division for over a month last year. And similarly, the State Department also suspended its FOIA operations for a similar amount of time, claiming a need to reduce and reprioritize non-mission critical services, which is eerily reminiscent of some of those non-essential services language that we saw at the state level. And I think it's interesting to talk about the precedents for a moment. Have we seen anything like this happen before? And a helpful parallel is government shutdowns, right? And during those government shutdowns, we have definitely seen federal agencies suspend processing of records requests under FOIA. A common trend we've seen during shutdowns is agencies say that they will resume FOIA operations when their funding is restored. So we have seen FOIA deemed non-essential at the federal level before, but during this pandemic, right, government employees are still working. It just looks a little bit different. And some agencies are very much still processing FOIA requests and making those releases. So the rogue decisions of some agencies to just totally ignore their obligations under FOIA was really troubling. But there's definitely an upward swing. Just like at the state level, we're seeing fewer and fewer of those suspensions in place. The same thing is true at the federal level. The FBI in particular had a lot of fluctuation in its record processing. It was actually at 50% capacity this spring, but it did resume full staffing levels as of May of this year, which is certainly helpful. But that reduction really did put a wrench in the public and the press's ability to get important records from that agency. NARA, the National Archives and Records Administration, still has reduced staffing as of just a few weeks ago. So requesters who are seeking archival records, like I know many of you in on the audience are researchers and academics. So for folks seeking archival records that may only be housed in hard copy format at one of their research centers, for example, there have been really significant delays up until essentially the present.
Thank you, Gunita. We'll move on to the other panelists, and we'll take a lot of these questions toward the end. And I'll note for the participants that once Gunita and David and Tonu have given their presentations, they'll have a few minutes each to talk about the resources that their organizations offer to the press and the public and open government organizations. Before we move on, David, there was one quick question that I want to address. Joe Kunstler was asking about the number of the law that Gunita was referring to, and I believe that was probably the bill numbers. And Joe, you can post again if I do not have that correct. But I think Gunita and Todd, we could make that available to the participants after those. I believe that was a reference to Alabama and California and Hawaii that have instituted in statute remote meetings and what those laws say. So I think we can provide a reference to those actual to those bills. So Joe, thanks for the question. If that was not exactly your question, post that again and we will clarify. Now we'll turn to David Snyder of the First Amendment Coalition based in California. David.
Thanks, Tom. And thank you all for being here on a topic that has consumed much of my organization's time for the last year and a half. I wanted to start by sharing with you a line from an emergency ordinance that the city of Fresno, California passed on March 19th, 2020. That happened to be the same day that California's governor issued statewide stay-at-home orders. So the Fresno order talks about city services that won't be suspended, including hot meals for seniors, and it notes that utility and sanitation services will not be discontinued for non-payment. And then it has this nugget, quote, non-essential city services may be suspended, including but not limited to responding to requests under the California Public Records Act. So that line caused some howls in our offices, alarm. It speaks generally of non-essential services, but then it only offers one example of that. And that one example is the California Public Records Act. So as Gunita said, a lot of agencies, I think, treat, and unfortunately, generally treat open records laws as sort of optional or of lesser importance. And it's a big problem. So, we've done what we can to combat this attitude. We promptly issued a statement in conjunction with SPJ chapters in California, reminding all government agencies that transparency is indeed an essential service, and maybe even more so in the context of a pandemic, when the public has an absolute need to know how the government's responding and what it's doing. And also in California, unlike many other states, the Public Records Act was never amended, and the governor never purported to change anything about the law, its deadlines or otherwise, by executive order. So Fresno was maybe one of the more blunt agencies, but it was far from alone. I wanted to talk briefly about 3 categories of issues that we've been dealing with, and I'll try to sprinkle some tips or pointers as I talk about these as a way of explaining, what can you do when you encounter these problems? The 3 categories are public records, public meetings, and then one that I think has gotten lost in the shuffle a little bit over the last year and a half, and that's court proceedings, not just trials, but any court proceedings. Starting with public records, we saw 2 flavors, if you will, of the same problematic attitude. One is we're suspending compliance, and 2 is this is going to take us a really long time because, hey, there's a pandemic on. So as to 1, suspending compliance, that's a clear non-starter, at least in California and the states where that didn't happen. As I said earlier, California's public records and open meetings laws were never suspended, though the latter was modified in some important ways that I think were actually beneficial. So, suspending compliance, that's a fairly easy one to confront, at least in California, say no such thing. The law remains the law. 2, this is going to take us a really long time. That's more problematic and kind of insidious, harder to combat. Although in California, there's a hard and fast deadline for providing a determination letter. There is no hard deadline for actually producing records. And even if the determination is late, the only way to really enforce it is to bring a lawsuit, which is beyond the ability of many people. So what do? Well, as has always been the case with Public Records Act, with FOIA, with any state's public records law, persistence and a methodical approach are really crucial, even more so when you encounter headwinds like we did in the pandemic. So that means, keep your calendar, follow up, be a pain in the butt with the agency. When they miss a deadline, when they make an assertion that doesn't seem to be right, write back, follow up. And there's a third category that sort of a subcategory that I wanted to talk about where we've been active. That's access to records about the pandemic itself. So records relating to COVID outbreaks and so forth. Many agencies have been very reluctant to provide access to that kind of data. And we've seen a kind of rampant misciting abuse, if you will, of HIPAA, the federal privacy law. HIPAA, that law only applies to records that might lead to individual identification of people. In many cases, the records being sought are aggregate data, much too high a level for individual identification to be an issue. So that's another area where pushback may be possible and fruitful, is to say, you don't get to withhold county level data and just numbers of cases because of HIPAA. There are a lot of other reasons that HIPAA may not apply, but the simplest one is that it generally relates to only individual identification of people or the potential individual identification of people. So let me talk a little bit about meetings. 2 broad issues with respect to access to meetings. First is just access to the proceedings, period, getting in. whether that means remotely or in person, which of course was impossible through much of the pandemic. And then the second, maybe more important one, is the ability to comment in real time at meetings. As to the first, just access to proceedings, as Gunita said, there's actually been quite good progress here, and progress that I hope will continue after the pandemic is a distant memory. Agencies took a while, but over time have become, I think, fairly adept as a general matter at putting the meetings on Zoom, perhaps putting them up on a YouTube channel. If they already had a website that provided access to meetings, using that, that's all to the good. The ability, allowing the public to comment in real time at meetings has been a little bit of a different issue. First of all, this right is really central to any open meetings laws. The ability of the public to interact with the legislative body in real time is really, I think, where the rubber meets the road in terms of local democracy. Your right to stand up and tell the city council or the school board what you think is really crucial. That interaction is at the core of everything. And we've seen a lot less compliance generally here. Efforts to cabin commentary to written comments, and sometimes written comments that have to be submitted 24 hours in advance, sometimes written comments that are ignored, sometimes they're read into the record. At least in California, the law, I think, is quite clear that the right to address the legislative body is the way the Brown Act in California puts it. That right means live and in real time. And it's not rocket science to provide that ability as a technological matter. Many agencies do it, but many agencies have not, and we've pushed back where we can on those. A couple of stray miscellaneous issues that have come up from time to time regarding public meetings. One is whether the cameras are on or off for the members of the legislative body. There's something kind of untoward about everybody being invisible behind the dais, if you will. I don't know that there's a great legal argument that they have to have their cameras on, but we've made the point as early and often as we can that it's really best practice, obviously, for the legislative body to show the faces of the people who are behind the dais. And then another issue is online only access. In other words, so an agency is providing online access, but it's only online. There's no phone, there's no way to dial in by phone. That matters because not everybody has internet access or a computer. Zoom is a fairly easy solution to the problem because you can dial in or you can go in by way of the web interface. But some agencies are doing online only. So again, we've encouraged phone access as well. The third kind of bucket that I wanted to talk about is court access. And as I said, I think this flew a little bit below the radar in many places, but there were court proceedings happening across California every day and across the country with no public access. So I'm not necessarily talking about trials. There are a whole lot of hearings that happen. The vast majority of proceedings that happen in court are not trials or even pretrial proceedings. All of those, almost all of those proceedings, the public has a First Amendment right to attend those. Unlike public records and public meetings, this is a federal constitutional right that we have, again, arising under the First Amendment, to attend proceedings. So it's important, but it's also a little bit more difficult to ensure, as a technological matter, to ensure that there's some form of remote access to court hearings for the public. We had a campaign with all 58 superior courts in California to strongly encourage them to provide free telephone access to the public for the proceedings that were happening in courts where there was no physical access possible. And we made the argument that under the First Amendment, alternative access is required. And I think we encouraged compliance in many courts. Many courts moved fairly quickly to provide some form of audio access for the press and public. We filed one lawsuit in federal court against the Kern County Superior Court in Southern California because they were really dragging their feet. We were able to, through a settlement, resolve that so that there's a pretty good, free, generally available phone access to proceedings happening in Kern County Superior Court. So, so those are the three buckets of topics, of problems that we've encountered. As to what you can do with records, as I mentioned earlier, persistence is always important under state public records laws, under federal FOIA, never more so than now. The growing trend of agencies treating these laws as kind of optional, or, well, if we feel like it, really took off during the pandemic. Unfortunately, as Gunita laid out, the delays have really grown rapidly. You just have to keep coming back. Mark your calendars, follow up again and again. Sample letters can be very helpful, if for no other reason than just as a time-saving device. We have a number of sample letters on our website. I know Reporters Committee does as well. Lots of groups have these. Use them. We have COVID-specific sample letter on our website that can really be helpful. As to meetings, push back against efforts to cabin public comment, to written comments submitted in advance. If you're a journalist, cover it if you can. And publications editorializing on these kinds of things can really have a lot of impact, because when you're talking about public meetings, you're talking about almost always elected officials. They are, or should be, responsive to public sentiment. And so if they're turning their cameras off, that should be a political problem for them. Make it a political problem for them if possible. And that can move the needle on policies about transparency. Tom, I'll stop there. I think I'm actually a little bit over my time. So glad to address any of your questions or questions that have come in over the comments.
There are some really great comments and questions that have come in related to both the public meeting aspect and the court aspect that David and Gunita both addressed. So I think we've got some good openings for a discussion at the end with the Q&A portion. And I think why don't we just kind of hold off on those for a minute, because I would like to hear from Tonu, but it looks like we've got a good start to a more robust discussion toward the end. So David, thank you very much. And why don't we flip it to you, Tonu?
Thanks, Tom. Can you hear me okay? My internet tells me it's unstable. Or
Yes.
Zoom tells me my internet is unstable. Okay, so thank you again for convening this panel, and really thank you to the NFOIC for this important conversation. And I do commend the fact that we're both looking within the United States as much outside. And one of the things that unsurprisingly was very striking when David and Gunita spoke is just there's so much that is unfortunately similar in some of the trends that we're seeing outside as well. So we've been focusing a lot on the pandemic and what we've seen, but one of the things I think we really reflected across the 78 countries that Open Government Partnership, where I work at the membership base, one of the things we've seen is before the pandemic, of course, there was some pretty significant gains on government transparency. So there were about over 100 countries had access to information laws right down to the local level, with local government at national government level. But there were problems. We weren't quite in a utopian state, and some of the challenges that we're talking about now are challenges and those gaps in capacity that already existed before the pandemic that actually got exacerbated. So I think one of the things to think about is what are some of the things and long-term gaps we also want to fill as we're thinking about some of the pandemic specific challenges, right? And these include maintenance of data systems, budgets given to these offices. Often a lot of these budgets, especially at the local level, are extremely inadequate, interoperability of these systems, et cetera. Now, one of the first things, and Gunita talked about sort of the emergency laws passed at the state level. When the pandemic hit, among the countries we were looking at, one of the first casualties was actually the willingness and transparency capacity of governments to proactively disclose information. And we were looking at data across across the countries that we're looking at. And it wasn't just countries in the global south, right? You'd expect countries in the global south. So countries like Brazil or South Africa had some of those challenges where once officials were working from home, they couldn't access their systems, they weren't willing to open up meetings, there were strict lockdowns. But this was also equally in the global north. So of course, we've heard about different states in the US, but equally in countries like Canada or in Germany, we had similar challenges, which spoke both to administrative delays and capacity questions. Now, unfortunately, it's not just about some of the technical and capacity challenges. A lot of this was about political will as well. And that's sort of, you know, it clearly came through in some of the pieces that David and Gunita shared as well. And the rollback on government transparency is very often in conjunction with a lot of the other trends we see, where there's sort of pushback on press, pushback on right to protest. And I just want to give you a sense of the data. And some of these headlines are from the data we've collected from March 2020 to March 2021, so about a year in the pandemic. We saw that nearly one in every 5 countries of our, out of our 78 members suspended or altered its RTI framework in response to the pandemic. And a lot of these did not have an end date in when they suspended these for, and that is extremely important. The second is about a fifth of these countries, and we talk about not just access to information requests, but proactive disclosure of data. About a fifth of OGP countries or our member countries were not regularly publishing basic data around the pandemic that was essential, like testing data or data around infection, right? And this again included countries in the global north. And we see that now about vaccines. So information about vaccines, expenditure, contracts, and day-to-day government functioning around programs, welfare programs, is not accessible. The third thing we saw was that a lot of this, there wasn't sort of systems for verification put in place. And again, this is, I know, a problem in several states in the US as well, where verification of information is a problem if agencies aren't putting them out proactively. And then we've seen huge instances of misinformation and disinformation. So there are those threats to think about as well. And then finally, that I was talking about was sort of course, lack of an end date in terms of the emergency provisions, but equally legislative oversight. So, about at the moment, even until to date, there are about 5 countries that we're looking at where legislative oversight is completely imposed. And one of the things that is a problem is that any of these emergency measures cannot be rolled back without this kind of legislative oversight. And again, this is not just parliaments, but this also includes sort of local councils and local Congress. Now, why is this really significant as we think about sort of rollback of government transparency in relation to other trends? One is, of course, we've all talked about sort of the media being able to access records, people being able to access meetings and information, misinformation, disinformation, but we're also seeing significant issues relate to corruption around government contracts, kind of access to budgets that citizens are able to have, as well as decision-making around budget allocations, so on and so forth. Now, the couple of things that I do want to also highlight is what are some of the sort of tools that people are using in other countries as they're looking at countering these trends. So one of the big things that we've looked at and the previous panelists spoke about is around digitization. Now, there is a temptation for a lot of people to talk about digitization as a silver bullet solution, right? There was no doubt that digitization made more effective and enabled a lot of this information to be put out proactively. And in some cases, so one example from Spain is digitization did allow for more diversity. I saw a question about it in the chat earlier, where some of the meetings that are held by the Spanish government under sort of one of the requirements of their membership under Open Government Partnership is to hold multi-stakeholder meetings with different government agencies involving civil society and journalists. Earlier, when these meetings were held, they were held only in the capital. But one of the things that we saw that with meetings going online, there was more diversity in these meetings being held. The other thing that was really interesting is they tied up with some community groups that then those local communities into their spaces and offices as and when those COVID restrictions allowed. So this automatically opened up access to more people, but those sort of tie-ups and relationships were really important where the government really encouraged them proactively. Other examples we saw in South Korea or New Zealand, where ombudsman offices and information offices were strengthened. Their capacity was strengthened and more resources were given. And we also saw them use other platforms meant for citizen engagement for use and provision of COVID-related data, but also more timely government information around budgets and vaccines and other things. So really a sort of use of different platforms that are available, because not all citizens use similar platforms, was something that we saw done. Now, one of the challenges that also we need to talk about is of course, focus on platforms, because I think that I was on a panel earlier today and somebody asked about use of blockchain for government transparency. And, it is really tempting to talk about platforms and technology, but one of the things I think we forget is that technology evolves really fast. So how do you talk about platforms and technology, but also talk about the principles that underpin it, right? So how are these platforms open source, open access? What kind of community engagement is built in? Where is this done online and offline is really important to focus on. The final piece is around that longer term strengthening from the gaps that we're seeing right now. So one of the really, really critical pieces, as I saw, was budget and capacity across countries. And it is important to build capacity for proactive disclosure. So not just response to requests, but really proactive disclosure in open formats and in open source. And also strengthening the record keeping capacity that Gunita and David spoke about at length. Something that we've seen some countries do is look at providing records online and offline, because again, not everyone is able to access digital records. And some of that offline pieces are provided at government offices, in central government offices, around programs that we know or governments know citizens need more information on. And I think that dual piece was very, very essential for record keeping capacity, but also accessibility in terms of sharing. The final piece is working with Information Commissioner Office as well as Ombudsman offices who are able to also train other agencies. One of the key pieces we saw that not all government agencies, courts and public offices had training to provide some of this information in real time and in a situation of crisis. So what kind of training programs can be put in place? And this training doesn't just need to be done by government. Of course, there are several organizations, including those on this call, who provide that kind of training. And I think doing that across agencies was essentially important. One of the things is also, I think, getting information commissioners, and in the United Kingdom, one of the critical things that the Information Commissioner's Office did was in the first few days of the pandemic, they published guidance on delays, record keeping, data breaches, and post-crisis restoration. So again, what kind of guidance could be found or can be at least put into place now from the learning in the initial days of the pandemic, including the right to appeal where some of these records aren't in place, because this right to appeal and accountability processes are not always clear. And finally, I think the very last point is how do we get sort of looking at strengthening existing right to information laws and open data systems, but also looking at sort of longer term strengthening, including, say, mandate publication of metadata on performance of these systems and making that available largely, disaggregated data by level of agency and office, which is not always done, are just some things to think about. So I'll stop there, Tom.
I'm going to find you just for a hot second. If you could maybe just describe briefly maybe how your organization works directly with organizations abroad. I will say too, I wish everybody was like New Zealand and South Korea, so we need more of that. But maybe just very quickly how you work directly with organizations in other countries to open access, to do training, and the resources that your organization would provide?
Sure, Tom. So Open Government Partnership is a member-driven partnership, 78 member countries and 76 local governments, including several local governments in the US. And one of the things we do is we provide a framework in place for governments and civil society to work together on essential government transparency and accountability practices. So really something that we're able to do is connect people to organizations across the world working on the same problems that you're working on, collect good practice and make that available. The other thing we're able to do is share data on any of the issues around government transparency, record keeping, access to information, etc., that including ways that other countries are doing this, and connect directly with implementation officials. This is something we're able to do again at the local level or national level. Third is we provide, we sort of, and I'm happy to put links in the chat. During the pandemic, one of the things we asked our members to do was share information about the ways they are proactively making information data systems and information systems that they're putting in place, as well as sort of outreach to citizen groups. And we kind of like created a good practice resource during the pandemic. And I'm happy to share that again in the chat for people to look at and make the necessary connections as people may like.
That would be great. And then we can say that and make that available to everybody afterwards. Thank you, Tonu. And then Gunita and then David, if you could just very briefly describe some of the resources the Reporters Committee and the First Amendment Coalition make available to the press and the public, good government groups, when they run into problems. And then we'll get to after that.
Absolutely. I will note that if an agency is still citing the pandemic as a means to delay processing your request, the Reporters Committee has compiled a chart, which is on our website, and I think it was posted in the chat in this panel, but I'll also make sure it's on my speaker profile so you can easily access that chart. And what it does is it has information about the status of open government laws across the country for journalists and others to consult as you all navigate the restrictions that we've been discussing. And reporters, they call in and they tell us that it's been a helpful resource because it doesn't just explain what modifications have been enacted to suspend agencies' duties, but it also includes examples of good government entities that are continuing to value the public's right to know. So if you're dealing with a stubborn or non-responsive agency, I highly suggest you consult that chart and say, hey, here are plenty of agencies just like yours that are still prioritizing the public's right to know right now. So you should do the same because it's obviously possible. And we've definitely heard from journalists who have said that this sort of dance between shaming the agency or encouraging them to comply has often worked. And I also want to flag for you the Reporters Committee hotline where you can write in or call in 7 days a week. And we have media lawyers who will help you with any kinds of public records questions or news gathering questions that you may have, whether related to COVID-19 restrictions or otherwise. So please definitely take advantage of that.
Thank you, Gunita. And David, was there anything, I know you talked about some of these resources, but was there anything you wanted to add about the resources that the FAC has available?
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, one crucial thing, if you have the ability and the time, is to educate yourself a little bit about what the relevant laws. So if it's California Public Records Act, if it's the Brown Act, if it's FOIA, and we've got a lot of materials on our website that are geared toward concisely explaining the key points. And there are other resources like that around. And then second, Fax Hotline is available to anybody. Don't have to be a journalist. You can submit your question online. If you are a journalist, in particular, if you're a journalist on deadline, I encourage you to call. You'll be able to talk to me or one of our other lawyers promptly. And we can help, although our bandwidth is somewhat limited, we can help in working through responses to bad responses. And then take a look at our sample letters. We have one general Public Records Act sample letter, a general FOIA. We also have a Public Records Act sample letter that deals with, that is sort of pandemic specific. And we also have trainings that we put on, a limited number every year, but one-on-one or one on 10 or 15 trainings for journalists. We call them our FOI boot camps. So take a look at that page on our website and reach out if you think you have a group of journalists that would like to learn more.
Okay, thank you, David. I think we might start with public meetings. This is kind of going back to the beginning. Both Gunita and David spoke about this. Tonu, you spoke about this in other countries. There's a couple good questions in the chat, and David or Gunita, if your organizations already have a hot sheet on this, please mention. But two related questions. One, had you, maybe we'll start with Gunita. Is there anything to indicate that during the virtual meetings, certain voices were excluded? And David, maybe you ran across this in California as well, that because there were so few ways to access the meetings, or because the questions were screened, were there communities that were unable to participate? And the other is just simply the best practices that you could lay out. I'm imagining if you're even a press association or a good government group, and you want to have a voice perhaps in the legislative process, if they are talking about making virtual meetings permanent, what are some of the best practices that we should ask for in terms of making those as accessible and as sort of freewheeling as possible, so that everybody has access, everybody can ask questions? So two related questions: best practices for virtual meetings, and also, have you run across any instances where certain communities have complained that they just simply did not get the access that they needed? So Gunita, maybe we'll start with you, and then David, and then Tonu, if you had something to add as well.
Sure. I'll start with the best practices bit. And I posted a link in the chat, which I think NFOIC is going to post in the broader chat. And once again, I'll post it on my speaker page so it's accessible. And that link is a series of best practices that the Reporters Committee has promulgated about how to ensure meaningful public access and meaningful public participation during the pandemic. And I think this note about best practices directly relates to that notion of inclusivity and diversity, and making sure that more voices are heard rather than not. And one example that I love, and you can find this in the tracker that I've mentioned a couple of times now, where we have examples from jurisdictions all over the country. There's a city in Missouri, and I don't know if I'm saying it correctly, but I think it's pronounced Florissant. So we're not talking about a large metropolitan area. We're talking about, a decent sized city that has been live streaming its city council meetings using a 3-camera broadcast system within its city council chambers. And each meeting video, you could view it full screen or alongside an agenda. And I really think that's a wonderful example of leveraging technology. The way David spoke earlier about, you want to be able to see who's talking. You want to be able to link, what speaker with what perspective and what views. And I think it is emblematic of the way I mentioned cities by and large, leveraging the power of technology to create that meaningful public access and participation. I think in terms of best practices, we also have this practice of pausing a meeting when there are technical difficulties, and then reconvening the meeting only when those tech issues have been resolved. And there has been guidance that came down from the Oklahoma Attorney General, for example, that spoke to that very issue. And we also saw that in other jurisdictions. Wisconsin's Department of Justice issued guidance encouraging entities to be mindful of the possibility that it might be burdensome for some who would like to observe meetings to do so remotely, like folks without internet access or those who are hard of hearing. And therefore, appropriate accommodations should be made to facilitate access for those individuals. So we've seen a wide spectrum of really impressive measures from all over the country, and I encourage you to check our tracker for more best practices.
And I'll chime in on, I think the Reporters Committee resource is tremendous. I would boil down best practices to a couple of things. One, agencies should be providing as many means of access as possible. So that means if physical access is possible in some capacity, great. That doesn't mean you should go turn off the channels that allow remote access. And as to the channels for remote access, there should be online access and also phone access for folks who don't have internet access or don't have a computer. There's at least one municipality in California that also has like a very low wattage, I assume, radio station where meetings are put out over the radio. You know, the more channels, the better. And winnowing down those channels once physical access becomes possible is a bad idea. That's not best practice. Why not leave it open for everybody? In terms of communities excluded, I mean, I think when you're speaking about records or meetings, anytime you throw up more challenges, more steps, you're going to necessarily exclude folks. And the process for accessing meetings, for accessing records, should be as simple and, where possible, as low tech as possible, so that as broad an audience as possible can participate. You know, a lot of the barriers that we saw thrown up during the pandemic, you know, you have to submit your comments by email 24 hours in advance, for example. That barrier by itself is obviously a problem. But the first time I looked into one of these, it took me, a lawyer, quite a while to figure out that that's what I was supposed to do. You know, it was like going one web page to the next one. So wait, and who do I submit it to? It's those kind of additional steps that just make it harder for people generally, but particularly people with less time, with less access to technology, you know, people who are working 2 or 3 jobs, they don't have the time to do all that stuff. And it's not necessary to put all of those barriers in place. So that's my 2 cents on that topic.
Great, thank you, David. And Tonu, I would be curious whether your organization had any success stories during the pandemic over the past 20 odd months or so, where you were able to gain access to a meeting somewhere that maybe was very difficult or did not exist or was closed off after the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I gave the example of Spain that opened up meetings beyond the capital city. And I think that we saw some of that happen. I think one of the things we saw was in some local governments, like in Buenos Aires, they started using channels like WhatsApp to increase access to communities beyond, you know, Zoom and online thing. And that included both on one-way information, so government to citizens, but also channels where citizens could sort of ask questions back. So I think one of the things we saw in the pandemic, it was very easy for the government to throw out data and for officials to throw out data, but very few channels of two-way communication, and some of the sort of WhatsApp pieces was one. The second is, you know, and I already gave again the South Korean example of sort of capacity on proactive disclosure. But one of the things they have is sort of a platform called the First Street, which is a sort of citizen monitoring, citizen engagement platform that is used to collect opinions on policies. But they reappropriated that in a way to run public campaigns on everything from like opening up meetings with specific agencies to running campaigns on how citizens could protect their personal data, because that became a big issue for citizens, and they were like calling up offices with a lot of their personal data, and this platform was sort of a gateway to that. Another piece I think that we saw worked well in some countries was that not all countries and not all platforms were able to use Zoom, right? And I think that sort of piece is something that not everyone thought about. And so what platform to use, whether it's Zoom or Teams, and, you know, we all joke about that in meetings, but that became a real barrier. And in France, what they did was create an open access, open source platform that people could use for meetings, that allowed more governments, but also more organizations to then open up access to meetings with their public officials, even when a couple of them were able to get access physically into some of these meetings. Because, as you know, the size of these meetings decreased, but in allowing some of these sort of open access, community sort of brokered conversations, or sort of organizational brokered conversations for some communities, those community organizations became a bridge between the community and those officials. So again, I think working more closely with community organizations, we saw work really well.
Great, thank you. And we have somebody from Buenos Aires on who is also supporting your promotion of WhatsApp, which is great overseas. So that's That's fascinating. And
So just to clarify, I feel
yes.
WhatsApp is a tenuous. So it's in this case it was really useful. We also know of several cases where it was really prone to sort of spreading misinformation and disinformation. But this is a specific thing I'm talking. So not promoting WhatsApp, promoting this specific initiative.
Yeah, and dis and miss is an entirely that's more than a panel. That's like 3 days, I think. I do want to we are bumping up against time limit, but there are questions about courts, and I'll flip it to David, but if Gunita and Tony, you want to talk about this quickly overseas, you certainly can. But the questions on the courts were related to access to records where they've gone virtual. In some cases, records are not available at all because you can't get access to the courthouse. Or we had a question from Texas where in that particular court system, they're allowing only 1 hour per day to review documents because of COVID protocols, no matter who else is in the courtroom. So David, are there any workarounds to this where you either maybe don't have access at all to certain court documents or where the access is extremely limited due to COVID?
Yeah, the problem of access to court records, not to mention court proceedings, there are as many problems as there are courthouses probably in the United States. But as a general matter, we have found that where possible, if you can have a direct conversation with the court clerk or even somebody in the court administrative office and lay out your issue, and that's not always possible, that can have some positive effects. We spent a lot of time over the past year trying to start those conversations, because sometimes the access problems are less about obstruction than they are about inertia, and bad practices start and then they continue. So direct appeal to court staff wherever possible. One of the questions in the comments highlighted I think the issue was being able to see court documents or slides, I guess, during the course of a court proceeding when you're watching the court proceeding by Zoom. And that's an interesting problem that candidly I had not really thought about, because if your exhibits are being put up during a trial, if you're sitting in the courtroom, you're going to be able to see those, but perhaps not if you're on Zoom. That's an issue of maybe kind of multi-camera, the way this small town in Missouri did it. I don't have a good quick answer for that, but I'll think about it.
Yeah, I think that was related to the insurrection and access to records there in Washington. And of course, that's federal court, which is even more difficult than the state courts. But that may be something to come back on later. I'm really fascinated too by this emerging issue of governments restricting or denying access related to COVID-19 data, whether it's outbreaks or vaccinations. I'm thinking that is probably worth another panel in and of itself. So I think I might do more on that, see if we can make some at least initial information about that available to the people who participated here to sort of kickstart additional conversations. I do think we're up against the time limit. Just David or Gunita or Tonu, are there any last thoughts you'd like to say before we break off? If not, I think we'll probably end it there. But David, Gunita, and Tonu, I really appreciate your time. Fascinating discussion. Great tips. I appreciate all your links. We're saving those. We'll make sure they get out to all the attendees. Really